From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
The Catholic world rejoiced this week with the announcement that Pope Leo XIV will soon proclaim St. John Henry Newman as the 38th Doctor of the Church. This week on Register Radio, we're joined by Register Senior Contributor Edward Pentin. And then, a seminary rector offers important advice from ways to foster children's spiritual development to why gathering around the dinner table is vital to the domestic church. We speak to Father Carter Griffin about his book, Forming Families, Forming Saints. Hello, I'm Matthew Bunson, host of Register Radio and EWTN News' Vice President and Editorial Director. I'm joined, as always, here in Washington, D.C. by Shannon Mullen, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register. Well, Shannon, there had been rumors and even assumptions for some time that Saint and Cardinal John Henry Newman might be named the next Doctor of the Church. Well, of course, those hopes came to pass this week with the announcement that Pope Leo would name the great theologian, apologist, and convert the 38th Doctor of the Church, joining such titans as Thomas Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, Irenaeus of Lyon, Robert Bellarmine, and Therese of Lisieux. Shannon, this is certainly exciting news.
Yeah, it was nice to get awakened this morning with some good news, some really happy news. And my first question that I thought of when I read the text was, I've got to ask Matthew to explain exactly what is a doctor of the church.
It's actually a great question. I've been getting a few texts myself over these days asking, okay, what does it mean to be a doctor of the church? Well, first, it's probably within the life of the church, one of the most exclusive groups that you'll ever imagine. Just 38 men and women. 4 women, including, as I mentioned, Therese of Lisieux, Teresa of Avila, Hildegard of Bingen, and Catherine of Siena. But essentially, the doctors stretch from the early days of the church, from Irenaeus of Lyon all the way to Therese of Lisieux, who died in 1897. And there are 3 requirements to be proclaimed a doctor of the church. The first is that you have to be a saint. So you have to be canonized with a demonstration of conspicuous holiness. The second, and in many ways even more important, is having left a massive contribution to the life of the church in her theology, in her spirituality, in her understanding of Christ, and leading people to holiness. And finally, as we just saw with Pope Leo XIV, some kind of a formal declaration. Can be done by an ecumenical council, but throughout history, it's only been done so far by the popes themselves. So that those are pretty stringent requirements, and it is just such a joy that we have this newest doctor of the church, John Henry Newman. And I know we're both excited to be joined by Edward Pentin, Register Senior Contributor, who's in England, I believe, and who himself, I think, has in his life been deeply moved by St. John Henry Newman. So, Edward, welcome.
Hi, Matthew. Hi, Shannon. Good to be with you both.
So, what was your reaction to the news?
Yes, I mean it was excellent news. I think anyone who's followed St. John Henry Newman's cause will be delighted at this. As you said earlier, it was kind of on the cards. It was something that many people have talked about, and in fact, last year the bishops of England and Wales issued a formal petition to Pope Francis to proclaim him a doctor of the church. And so this has been the development since then. There's been a lot of work, a lot of drawing together a lot of the documents together with the postulator, Father George Bowen from the Oratory in London. And so yes, it's the fruit of all of that work.
Yeah, Edward, back in November at the U.S. Bishops' Conference Fall Assembly, there was a unanimous motion to really join with the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales to propose this idea. I know the bishops of Ireland and Scotland also were behind it. And it was really interesting. I remember Bishop Barron strongly supporting the motion and saying it could be a marvelous teaching moment for the church. And he did talk about the fact that that many on sort of the right and the left, if we could use those kind of crude descriptors, really identify with Newman so much, and that this was another way in which he really kind of speaks to the very polarized era that we live in. Why is that? What is the quality of Newman that really speaks to such a broad range of perspectives?
Well, I think talking to people who follow this cause very closely, it's a lot to do with the fact that he appeals to both the intellect and the heart. And I think by drawing those together, his witness, especially in his teaching, is very powerful. And I think that is also what what I think many feel has sort of brought unity as well between those sectors of the church. So I think that's a large part of it. And also, I think there's an element also with his orthodoxy. I mean, he is, of course, to be a doctor of the church, you've got to be excel in orthodoxy, and he did that. And orthodoxy, as we know, is very unifying. So I think all of those elements come together. As you know, there has been controversy recently over recent years about development of doctrine, and some have said that St. John Henry Newman was sort of utilized to further that, either by those pushing for an illicit sort of development of doctrine and those trying to stand by the orthodox teaching, which of course is the one that Newman proposes. So that also figures into this, and there are some who are concerned that this might confirm those who are pushing for that sort of heterodox view, and those who are saying that actually this will confirm the authentic development of doctrine and the teaching on the authentic development of doctrine. So it's an interesting aspect as well that figures into this.
Yeah, Edward, on that very point, how, from your standpoint, is Newman that role model for engaging with the culture? I mean, he's certainly one of the great apologists, but somebody who underwent this very profound spiritual journey that led him to the church, both intellectually, of course, but also in his heart. So can you talk about that conversion and why that matters for people today?
Yes, well, he was, as I say, he came to it very much intellectually to the faith. As somebody said, he thought his way into the church, and he did very much do that. And I think it was through his sort of studying it and really taking it, to his heart as well, as I said earlier. I think that's all part of it. And I think it was all. Also, there was this very famous book he wrote, Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which had a big influence on me actually at my conversion, which was very much sort of getting at those arguments and trying to reason with those on the Protestant side who couldn't see the Catholic faith as a true faith, and very much explaining why it is in a very powerful and convincing way, and so that's all been part of I think the strength and the appeal of Cardinal John Henry Newman, and I think that's why it's seen as so valuable today when society is very much a bit lost in terms of faith and reason. They don't understand the importance of faith and reason and how they complement each other and go together. And he was someone who was very strong on bringing together science and religion, science and the faith, and showing that, if they both come from God, if they're both true, then there's no reason why they can't complement each other and be unified with each other, and in that sense. And so I think that's all part of it, and seen as very much, again, as the strengths and the main appeal of Newman.
Is there a dimension too in Newman that it is that very remarkable intellectual aspect of in him, but that also led to this abiding love in Christ? I mean, that great motto of his, cor ad cor loquitur, the heart
Right.
speaking to heart.
Yes, indeed, and putting Christ at the center. And I think that's interesting that the parallels there with Pope Leo XIV, who since his election in May has been very much focused on putting Christ at the center and speaking both intellectually with his theology, but also heart, speaking from the heart as well, and putting, as I say, Christ at the center. They're very much similar in that way. And I think there's no coincidence that he's wanted perhaps to push this early on in his pontificate, which, funny enough, is what Pope Leo XIII did. One of his first acts, apparently, was to make Cardinal
Mhm.
John Henry Newman a cardinal. So there's interesting parallels there with the two Leos.
That's fascinating. Edward, the one of the things that I know that you focus a lot on in your reporting, the people you profile and talk to, is you place a high priority on the virtue of courage, right? Newman is one of the most celebrated converts, I think, in modern times, but he paid a price for his conversion, right? Can you talk a little bit about the reaction to his entrance into the Catholic Church at the time?
Yes, I mean, he was very much, as many Catholic converts were at that time, kind of ostracized by society. Becoming a Catholic in those Victorian times was not easy, and it was considered to be, in some ways, almost a betrayal of the nation. And so it was very difficult for him, and there was a lot of fallout for him for that. So again, yes, that element of courage is very important in his witness, and again underlines the heroic virtue that he had, and also the great holiness, the personal holiness that he had, which is of course why he's a saint. So yes, that all figures into it.
Yeah, and talk about the impact of this declaration. We have Venerable Bede, who is from England,
Hmm.
but the English that he spoke would essentially not be recognizable to people today, and his life was largely in Latin. But we have this remarkable English-speaking doctor of the Church being named by an English-speaking pope. What's the impact you think that this might have on England, on Great Britain writ large, and for also American Catholics?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, Matthew, because it's happening at a time when we see very many sort of examples of a revival of the Catholic faith in England, particularly. So it's really interesting that this is happening now, and will of course help that because, as you say, here's an English-speaking saint. There've only been, as you say, three doctors of the church who are from England. The other was St. Anselm of Canterbury.
Hmm.
But of course, he was Italian, so you've got
Right.
um, really this great English saint being made a doctor of the church, one of only 38, at a time when the faith does seem to be re-emerging in this country. So it is an interesting, as I said, really interesting that it's happening now, and there are quite a few examples of this revival happening. So this is just the latest, it seems.
Edward, first I wanted to ask about the reaction in England. You've been writing a lot for the Register about sort of these fits and starts of signs of hope, of renewed faith in England, but at the same time, there's been these other, very distressing
Right.
setbacks and things like that. So just with the news today. Generally, what's been the reaction, particularly among Catholics there?
Well, among the faithful here, it's been obviously very, very positive. There are some concerns, as I said earlier, that it could be part of a ploy to push a more modernist sort of interpretation, but I will have to wait and see. But I think, generally speaking, it's extremely positive, and as I see, seen as a great boost at a time when there are many signs of darkness, as it were, in the country, especially in terms of politics and the political leadership. And you've had these two but many found very shocking developments in the English Parliament about um, allowing a decriminalization of abortion up to birth and assisted suicide. So this comes at a very special time in that sense as well, and it's a beam of light, if you like, in a very dark, an increasingly seemingly dark time over in this
And
country.
so, as is always the case, he's the doctor of the church we need at this particular moment, isn't he?
Indeed, that's what many have been saying, yes, after today's news.
Yeah. Well, Edward, thank you so much, and I look forward to reading your pieces that are going to be coming up at the National Catholic Register, and I look forward to further conversations about John Henry Newman.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. Good to be with you, Ben.
Well, you're listening to Register Radio here on EWTN Radio. Next, we talk with Father Carter Griffin about his book, Forming Saints, Forming Families. Stay tuned to Register Radio here on EWTN.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
And welcome back to Register Radio. I'm Matthew Bunson in D.C., as always, with Shannon Mullen, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register. Well, in the introduction to his recent book, Forming Families, Forming Saints, our next guest has written, I know what you might be thinking. What is a celibate priest doing giving advice to parents? Well, the answer to that becomes obvious once you start reading. Father Carter Griffin is the rector of St. John Paul II Seminary in Washington, D.C., and is a graduate of Princeton University and a former naval officer. And he's also the author of Forming Families, Forming Saints. And I'm delighted to welcome him to Register Radio. Father, welcome.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Good to be with you.
So obviously, let's start with the very question that you pose at the start of your book. What is a celibate priest doing giving advice to parents?
Well, I think the one thing is that the work of a parent and the work that I do in the seminary is there's a tremendous amount of overlap. I think in both senses that the church is always in the business of formation. I mean, even for, you think about what the church is, it's a place where disciples are generated, where they are formed, and then where they're sent out on mission. And that's what we do in a really concentrated way in the seminary. But that's also what every family is supposed to do. You know, if you think the Second Vatican Council called the family the domestic church, and the church is where formation happens. It's the smallest cell of the universal church. And so I think that there is just a lot of wisdom that the church has gained over the years, over the centuries, in formation, which is certainly not to say that formation is anything close to perfect or that the priests are anything close to perfect, let alone, but that there is a lot of wisdom there. And I think over the years in my conversations with young couples especially, I just realized how much overlap there really was and they would even say sometimes, like, golly, that'd be helpful for me to read about too, you know, as I'm raising my own children. So I think in the interest of trying to close some of that divide and tap into that overlap, I tried to put together this book, which is certainly not complete and comprehensive. There's a lot of stuff that I have no competence talking about, but there are elements that the church brings that can be helpful for parents. So that's why the book.
Father, you talk in the book about this having a more intentional approach to family formation, and that the goal really is so much of it we think of, we're preparing our children to get good jobs and have successful lives and things like that. And what I liked about it is it really reorients us to what are we actually doing here? As Catholic parents, we're preparing them to be disciples of Christ. We're preparing them to be able to discern what it is that God has assigned for them to do in their life, what's going to make them happy. But we're also trying to make saints. Is really the saints out of our children. But that word family formation, the family is being formed too. It's not just the children. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, Shannon, I appreciate too the beginning of that because you talked about in a way parents already get this, right? We're just doing it in a way that might be too narrow, right? If you want to form, future successful professionals or citizens or whatever it might be, husbands or wives even, there's still an intentionality to it. And I guess what I'm proposing is that oftentimes that can be very narrow, and it just needs to be broadened. And one of the ways that the church does that in the seminary that I do in the book, which can also be done for families, is to make sure that there's no kind of gaps. You're looking at these different areas: the human and the spiritual, the intellectual and the apostolic. And so it's kind of it's a way of looking at any human life. And so it's just done very, very deliberately. And to your point, it's not just a matter of sort of individual, this person has to be formed in this way. That certainly is important, and we do need to focus on the individual temperaments and gifts and so forth of every child. But it's also sort of the family itself. The most important relationship in a family is between the mother and the father, right? If that relationship is strong, everything else is strengthened underneath it. But also the culture of the family at large. Is this a family that is interested in not just closing in and enjoying each other's company, but also reaching out to those in need? Is this a family where transparency and sincerity is promoted, or where it's diminished? Is this a family that is focused on each other, or simply a sort of getting ahead in my own life? So there's ways that the culture of the family at large also needs to have a certain intentionality to the formation. Yeah,
you talk about the need for renewal. Now, obviously, goes across every dimension of modern culture, but the idea of renewal for families and especially parents. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, renewal happens fundamentally when we have a kind of a new orientation of ourselves towards our goal, our proper end. There's a renewal that needs to happen, I think, in politics. There's a renewal that needs to happen within the church in certain respects, and in seminaries and all of that. And in many ways, a lot of this renewal has happened. This kind of new understanding of where we're supposed to be headed, kind of getting ourselves grounded again, and then figuring out the way forward. And because I think a lot of the confusion the last 30 or 40 years has just been a sort of meandering about and kind of losing our end, losing our purpose, losing our directionality. And I think that's true for families too. Families are fundamentally units that created by God, little micro communities created by God in order to create saints. Right? I mean, fundamentally, that's what we as Christians believe human life is all about, is becoming a saint and living forever with God in heaven. And so we normally are brought up in a family, so the family is the one that is intended to set children and parents on that path towards sanctity. And I think getting that back in place is the beginning of genuine renewal in the family.
Father, that's a great 30,000-foot view. Let's get down on the ground a little bit. What are some practical suggestions that you provide in this book?
I think a lot of them are under the human area. I think human is the one that if there were one I had to choose that is hardest to fix later on, let's put it that way, it would be the human formation. So this would be everything from building character and moral character, habits of life, freedom, just maturity, chastity, different things like that. So it's a broad area, but there are also a lot of really wonderful ways to promote that. I mentioned, the dinner table is a great place, where a lot of these virtues can be formed. But I think if the parents are aware that these are virtues and that they are virtues that need to be formed in children, I think they can be very intentional about that around the dinner table, to take that as an example. Or when a guest is in the house, building the virtue of hospitality. Like those are, in the human, there's obviously a ton of different ways that this becomes very concrete, very practical. To skip to the other side of it, the spiritual, obviously you're forming them in the prayer life and sacraments and so forth. Intellectual, there's just all kinds of things we could talk about there. But the apostolic is one sometimes that can be the most frightening, because it's like, this sounds like, you and your kids are supposed to get up on soapboxes and start preaching in the park. That's not what apostolic means. It means fundamentally being an apostle of Jesus Christ. And that happens through your words, it happens through your actions. And so recognizing that the family has this outward directionality to bring Christ outside the family, to those especially in need. And the need might not just be physical need, but spiritual need, those who are closest to us and even far away. So finding practical ways to make sure that no week goes by where there isn't some effort to reach out in whatever way by every family. That's a very practical thing, and that will deeply embed itself in the consciousness of children. So that's a very practical, concrete way to grow in this very important aspect of our life, which is going out to others and bringing others to Christ.
Father, just to follow up, in the interview you did with the Register, Zelda Caldwell asked about your experience with the seminarians. These are fine young men. Maybe not all of them will become priests, but they're discerning, they're studying. And she asked that their parents must be doing something right to get them this far. And you highlighted just a few quick things that you've noticed that are kind of common elements. Can you talk about what those are?
Sure, as long as I remember them. I remember that if the children see the parents striving to grow and striving to become better human beings themselves, and honestly being interested in the children growing as well, there's going to be a degree and a bond of trust, right? Even if there isn't perfection. That's going to be, I think, essential to a really healthy formation culture of the family.
Yeah, and in your time as a formator, what have you seen change in terms of the challenges that families face, and what are some of the key pieces of advice you give for adjusting to those changing circumstances? I think in particular the massive changes brought by things like social media.
Yeah, that certainly would be. So I've been doing this is 15 years, and so social media was already present, but it was just a fraction of what it is today. And obviously device attachment to devices and things like that. we've done a lot of things in the seminary to try to address those, beginning with kind of a first year, sort of a detox year, where they don't have the smartphone at all, they don't have social media at all. That's very helpful for a kind of just a period of unplugging. I don't know how many can do that. And that's kind of a luxury, I suppose, in a seminary, but I think it can be at least approximated in many ways. And so, like, the first thing is to be bold and courageous about a way of detaching ourselves, and, you know, if our children are already attached to that too. And, you know, finding some very practical, concrete ways that you can sort of, you know, keep yourself accountable to making that detachment. But then it's not just a matter of detaching, then it's a matter of re-engaging in a way where you can use these things virtuously. And so that means being extremely deliberate, you know, having the conversation with trusted people in your life, seeing, well, what is the purpose of this? Like, one thing I would say 2 points right off the bat. One is social media is intended for communication with others. It's not intended for zoning out and, you know, doom scrolling for hours on end. If that's what you're using it for, then it needs to be cut out, because that's not what it's intended for. And then the devices themselves, you know, there's a certain limit. There's a certain way that these devices have become like our default recreation. And I think that if we can honestly say to ourselves, look, basically, I think of recreation first and foremost as going to a screen and doing something, then I need to reorient how I look at recreation. It's no longer recreating anything, right? It's just kind of, you know, zoning me out. And so I think there's some very practical things you can look at in ways of diminishing that. And it's going to take a certain amount of kind of courage and, you know, forcefulness with ourselves. But I think everyone, when they do it, they just feel so much freer and so much happier for having done it.
Well, Father, thank you so much for this interview, but also for the very extensive interview you gave with Salva Colwood. You can find at ncregister.com. I encourage everyone to get a copy of your book, especially if you're a parent.
Matthew, thank you so much, and both you and Shannon, again, enjoyed being with you.
Well, that's it for this week for Register Radio. Remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, please check out the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks again for joining us here on EWTN Radio. Until next week, on behalf of our producer, Mike McCall, and Shannon Mullen, editor-in-chief of the Register, I'm Matthew Bunson. Please take care, and God bless.